last week, we were joined by Brett Stevens, who discussed his new book, and the larger theme of America and power. But if you actually just look at the world, think about the world, I think one would have to come to the conclusion, reasonable conclusion, that from the perspective of the Jewish state and the Jewish people, while America is certainly one pole of power which one must pay constant attention, the larger question of Islam in the Middle East would have to be the other large pole. And so we thought that to nest and frame our questions about Jews and power, it made sense to also just look sideways at America and power, and tonight, Islam, Muslims and power. Just during the break from this afternoon's session with Elliot Abrams, I ran back to my desk and just at random printed out the front page of the Washington Post. Just this afternoon, like what are readers of the Washington Post looking at? And you know, on a very normal day, 5 of the 12 headlines have to do with tonight's question. A day which, I mean, it's not like there's, you know, right now, that there's some grand American military action or anything else. But just again, like on a normal day, this is what the world is thinking about, talking about the major strategic threats and political opportunities come from our question. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Joining me next to me is Michael Doran, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. He worked for our teacher this week, Elliot Abrams, in the Bush administration, where he worked on the National Security Council, was responsible for helping to devise and coordinate United States strategies in a variety of issues related to the Middle East. He also worked as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. He's written in a wide variety of fora, but is certainly most famous for his extremely active Twitter account, Animated, which he'd be obliged to all of you for following. Next to him,
immediately.
Next to him is Dr. Hillel Fradkin, who's the director of the Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World, also at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Fradkin edits the center's journal, Current Trends in Islamic Ideology. I have to just acknowledge, I actually first was exposed to Hillel in a previous iteration of his life, in really penetrating articles about Spinoza, Rousseau, as a political theorist who later in life concentrated his energies in the questions of Islam, but an extremely broad and deep thinker. We're honored, and it's our pleasure to welcome both of you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So, look, I do think, all kidding aside, it does make sense to actually structure this conversation as a kind of, you know, if not debate, then conversation that pits 2 different tastes in thinking against one another. And so, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to just pose a question or make a statement, and then ask each of you to respond. And I do this, I just say this to all of you, I'm extremely inexpert in Islam and Muslim theology and Muslim politics, so I hope that my basic questions will be useful to you too. But the basic question that I want to ask and really begin tonight's conversation is the following. From Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Boko Haram, the myriad threats that the West faces, that Israel face, from Muslims, from the Islamic world, Islam has nothing to do with it. True or false? So, Hillel, can I invite you to...
Oh, you want me to start? Okay. Well, first, thanks for having me. And I was going to say that in keeping with what Jonathan said about some of my activities in the past, I was going to begin by taking you through a close reading of the Quran, but we ditched that sometime in the last 15 minutes. I should also say that I got into this racket. I was started out as a student of Rambam, and to do that, I had to learn Arabic, and that took me by a somewhat odd route to tonight's subject. Yes, it has a lot to do with Islam. How much is the question, and how essentially would be the question, it seems to me. What I was going to say, and I will just touch on this right now, I think, one has to finally look at the beginnings of Islam because the present is so obsessed with those beginnings. I mean, that is the two most vital movements in the Middle East today, radical Shiite Islam, radical Sunni Islam, are both obsessed, especially Sunni Islam, obsessed with the Muslim founding. And in the latter case, in the case of the Sunnis, they want to reenact it. If you look at their literature, they have a tendency to focus on Caliph Umar, the second caliph. For example, there was a very important speech given by Khairat al-Shatter, who was the deputy guide of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood when he got out of prison in 2011, where he talked about what the Brotherhood was about. And what the Brotherhood was partially about was following the sterling example of Caliph Umar, who, among other things, is responsible for the first great conquests of the Muslim polity. Like him, the Sunnis are, the radical Sunnis are very obsessed with the past. And in particular, what they're obsessed by is, we can say two things. One is that the glory of that past, as they see it, and their present situation in which they have lost that glory. My colleague, our colleague now that Mike's joined Hudson, former Pakistani ambassador Hussein Haqqani has put it more or less publicly this way, that the Muslim world is obsessed with a longing for a lost glory. That's the way he would put it.
Lost glory?
Lost glory. The glory in question being especially the glory of the founding, but everything up to about 300 years ago. And you see, over the last 15, 20 years, all of these fellows talk about, they'll talk about 1,100 years of success, 300 years of failure. So that's what's in their minds. And sometimes it leads to some very bizarre things from the point of view of politics. One example is the recent defense offered by the Islamic State of its enslavement, sale, and otherwise use of the women it's captured. It published, it's not published two things. One was an account of why this is not only legitimate, but desirable from the point of view of a kind of reenactment of the practice of early Islam as they understand it. The idea is sort of, if we do things the way the Prophet and the early companions of the Prophet did things, we will somehow magically produce the same results. And then this past week they produced a document in which it was sort of like their version of a fatwa, or in this audience one might say a tshuva, on exactly what the law is concerning captured women. You can see a decent translation of it on Memory's website. So they want to think of themselves as living in this past, recreating this past, so they can create the success of this past. Now, all of this is happening against, and I guess this is where I'll probably just shift over to Michael. It's happening within a context which is precisely not the past. It's not the situation that was characteristic of Muslim history up for 1,000 years when they were very successful. But they're living in a universe in which to some degree, the political terms of life were defined by non-Muslims. To begin with, the division of what were empires into states. Would be, I think, the crucial change for them. It's certainly one that obsessed the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim tradition, political tradition, was imperial. It was understood to be imperial. Ultimately a universal empire, but every iteration of it was imperial in some sense. Or some were pikers by comparison to others, but that was the way in which it conceived of itself as its political self-definition. Well, you know, the last empire that the Muslims had was the Ottoman Empire, and when it got defeated in World War I, it was dismembered. In fact, I mean, Turkey itself just barely survived, and was created. We have the system we have, or had, until very recently, of states, nation states in the Middle East, was created most famously by a French diplomat and a British diplomat named Sykes and Picot, who decided that from now on the people in this region would live like people elsewhere, in states, national states. And that creates a different kind of politics, and the early Islamists understood that. Hassan al-Banna, for example, said his project was to destroy states. Now, he didn't manage to do that, but the Islamic State, the latest sort of political phenomenon on the horizon, has managed partially to do that, one with the help of Mr. Assad and various other people, Prime Minister Maliki. We have now 2 states that are functionally dismembered, and others that might follow suit. Well, actually 3, if you include Libya. So I think at the present time, the question is how that dynamic is going to play out. I do want to, and I'll stop with this point, but it is deliberately also the ambition of the Islamic State to destroy that it's explicit. We've got to get rid of Sykes-Picot, and when they managed to capture the border between Iraq and Syria, there was a big berm there. They filmed their breaking of that berm and put it up on their website to show that we have finally triumphed over Sykes-Picot and nation states. They haven't exactly ultimately triumphed, and that's where I'll turn it over to Michael.
So what was the question again? Exactly the exact terms?
So all the threats that the West, Israel, the United States encounters from the Muslim world, Islam's got nothing to do with it.
Okay, I'll take that position. And I will affirm, yes, it has nothing to do with it. Or I'll put it this way, that these threats have as much to do with Islam as the Irish Republican Army has to do with Catholicism, or the Ulster Unionists have to do with Luther. In other words, religion is 2 things. It's a body of ideas about eternal things, and its identity. And we're making a mistake when we analyze the political disruption in the Middle East and assuming that the drivers of this are the bodies of ideas about life everlasting, rather than the identity side of things. And the identity side of things is, I think, the much more important. And it causes us confusion, because we have a tendency to categorize people according to religion, when there are lots of other categories that are much more important in terms of understanding what they do, but we overlook that because we put them in the Muslim basket. Now, there are these guys floating around in the mix, like Hillel mentioned, like the Islamic State, who are pushing very hard to say that there is no distinction between politics and religion, and if you have a certain and if you have a Sunni Muslim identity, then that compels you to behave in a certain way, and so on. But they're not the majority. They're just the most violent and the best organized. And so a space has opened up for them, which they are exploiting. But there's a lot more going on there than just a movement of religion against the West, or a movement of religion against the Israelis or the apostate regimes, however you want to put it. And even in the, if
That's
I just
usually how I speak about Israel.
is what is the
apostate regime.
no, the apostates or the Muslims. The Muslims who are you call it the Zionist entity. That's what you the
Tumor and cancer, I believe, is the official term for it.
The apostate regime is what the Jews call it that.
oh, is that like the Neturei Karta and
Not just.
yeah.
That's like
So-
pretty mainstream.
So where was I? Oh yeah, I was going to refute Hillel's example of destroying the berm on the Syrian-Iraqi border. If you look at if you scratch even the Islamic State, which I admit is operating to a certain extent according to religious edict, or at least aspires to. If you scratch it and you look under the surface, you notice some interesting things about it. One, there are a lot of former Baathists, former officers from Saddam Hussein's army that are involved in this. It's really, it's really the marriage of Islamic extremism together with Baathism. Hard to know where the one ends and the other begins. But if you look at the targets they're choosing, they're very careful. They're pretty savvy from a public from a propaganda point of view. Like, for instance, the Sinjar Mountain, where the Yazidis were. Okay, they're Yazidis, so they are fair game from a strict interpretation of Islamic law for taking them and enslaving the women and so on. But that territory, Sinjar, is traditionally in a no man's land between the Arabs and the Kurds. It's Kurdish. It's in the eyes of the Sunni Muslims of Iraq. This is Sunni Muslim territory that the Kurds took. So it's very clever from an Arab nationalist point of view, from an Arab identity point of view, as well as from an Islamic identity point of view, to grab that territory. Then, same thing with Kobani. Kobani in Syria is Kurdish. So again, there's a kind of Arab nationalist chauvinism behind this, and wiping out the berm between Syria and Iraq is as much a nationalist act, an anti-imperialist act, as it is a religious act. And it would be even more than a religious act. So religion is in there; it's in the mix for sure. But I think we miss an enormous amount when we focus in on the religion. And I guarantee you, these guys are not getting up every morning and reading the Quran in order to decide what they're going to do today. Actually, now that I said that, I realize that it's not entirely true with a group like the Islamic State. But in general, if we think that that's the way things are operating, we're gonna make a mistake. And then just one last thing, you guys all well know this audience knows well the Hamas. It's fine for Prime Minister Netanyahu to say that Hamas and the Islamic State, they're the same thing. It's a great talking point for an Israeli Prime Minister who, at a UN speech, needs to get his point across in a couple of sentences to the American public. But as political analysis, it doesn't hold up, right? These are two very different organizations. A certain similar spirit might run through them, but in terms of their goals, in terms of their organization, and so on, they're very, very different. And it was very striking to me that during the recent Gaza conflict, the Islamic State barely said a word about Gaza. In fact, they were quite happy to have the whole world focused in on Gaza, because it distracted everybody while they took over Iraq, or a big swath of Iraq. So They may both have an extremist Islamist ideology, but they have very, very different agendas, and they're not cooperating with each other in any meaningful way.
So, Mike, let me just ask you to respond to one formulation of Hillel's central thesis. The Muslim world now stands disgusted by the national form and longs for a past of enchanted purity. And it's an essentially, if not theological, then it'd be hard to call that strictly political source of imagination that inspires them.
You can.
Is that fair?
Yeah, you leave that as the formulation, and, and I'll say something after that.
Okay.
When you talk, once you get to that level, what can you explain with that? How do you explain, for instance, if you're going to use that as a concept for analyzing what we see before us?
I see you're looking this way when you ask that question.
What?
Look
Oh, oh, yeah. Okay. So how do we explain? How do we explain Sisi, for example? Right? Sisi is. I'm sure that Sisi regards himself as a respectable Muslim. He regards the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And if we have this concept that the Muslim world longs for regaining its lost glory and so on, we can find lots of examples of that in public statements that Egyptians make. But if we want to understand what Egyptians are actually going to do day in, day out, and how they are interpreting what's going on in the world, I think we really have to understand this conflict between the Muslim Brotherhood and Sisi. I think that's the single most important thing going on in Egypt, and I think it has been the single most important thing going on in Egypt. Not Sisi and the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Muslim Brotherhood and its enemies for a very long time. And so that is the kind of thing that I would point to.
Yeah, but look, Mike, that the Brotherhood. I'm not saying that everything is explicable in these terms, and besides that, there are various the passion that this longing and so forth, is obviously interpretable in a variety of different ways. I mean, if they could ever get their act together on the basis of a joint passion, we'd really be in trouble. But in fact, Shiites interpret it one way, Sunnis in another, and within the Sunni universe, you have these divisions, like between the Islamic State and Hamas, or between the Brotherhood and the Salafis. But I think in a way the Egyptian case is a very good case in point, because the Brotherhood was founded out of that longing. That's what Banna was all about. And yes, Sisi doesn't want to accept that longing. But that means that in some degree, the agenda is set by this longing and what it produces politically. It produces a whole variety of things politically, but that's one thing. Now, Sisi's response is very interesting. He knows, he apparently is a pious man, which apparently was the sucker punch he delivered on Morsi, to get appointed. And he also knows that that religious sensibility was very, very powerful at the polls. So he's not behaving like Mubarak. He is behaving like a man who seems to think he has to somehow put ordinary politics together with that religious sensibility. And he might be creating, I keep following this and trying to figure out just exactly what he might have cooked up in his head. Everyone, all the Egyptians I talk to just simply say, no, he can't be that clever or smart or anything like that. And maybe he's not, but it looked to me like he was trying to create something like a combo of Egyptian patriotism wrapped around a kind of religious sensibility.
Wait, sorry, Morsi or Sisi?
Sisi.
Sisi.
So, I'm not, you know, it doesn't drive everything, but it's it's explanatory of, and this is the way I put it, the movements that have the greatest vitality. If you look at a lot of what goes on in the Middle East, that isn't that. It's a kind of defensive action. It doesn't have a very powerful positive agenda anymore. It rather, I mean, all the, you know, the nationalism of the past doesn't have a powerful agenda. It's just trying to hold on to what was created by that in the first place. I also want to say that, you know, if we were to talk about the whole history of Islam, I could show, I think, very simply how powerful the connection is between religion and politics in the founding of Islam.
Let's do that.
But
let's
what I
we'll
want to say is
well, after that we'll do that because I'll give you the opposite interpretation.
Okay.
But let's do the Sisi Morsi first.
What I wanted to say is, from the very beginning, there were immense opportunities, often taken, of pious hypocrisy. So that is to say, there were people who wanted this to succeed as a religious political project, and others who, for various reasons, had a very substantial opportunity to turn it into what, in the circumstances, was a more simply political project, which served particular interests. In the usual case, it served some family or dynastic interest. Yeah, that happens. The question is, you know, and if we were going to dispute this long enough, I'd take you on about the Northern Ireland as well. It wasn't only religion, but there was a big religious element in that.
When I was in the Defense Department, I got a briefing about the Saudi 12-step program to rehabilitate Islamic extremists. They deal with Islamic extremism like a psychological malady. Theoretically, they do. They have a 12-step program, and
sorry.
Islamists Anonymous.
No, but they're not anonymous. This is actually a key part. And the 12th step is art therapy. They go through and they have a guy who got a PhD from the University of Michigan, and he has these guys make paintings. They paint. Now, it's actually this is for the Americans, right? It's to show the Americans how sophisticated they are, right? The way the program really works is the regime gets its claws into the families. So if you are an Islamic extremist, then the regime goes to your uncle and your father and gives them a car and some money and maybe a job and says, you know, keep this boy on the straight and narrow. And if he starts getting mixed up in extremism again, then they take the money and the car away and they reward the family or they punish the family. It's something you can't do in America, at least not legally. And then the family clamps down and holds on to it. But then for the Americans, they have things like the art therapy, right? So that when they're visiting American officials come, you can say, look what we have here. So
I'm glad you weren't taken in by this report.
But I found it very interesting because there was one of the guys painted a painting of a tree, a denuded tree in a fiery landscape. And it just screamed out symbol to me. And so I asked what it was a symbol of. And I was trying to think, you know, the tree of Islam, and I didn't know what it was. Anyway, the long and the short of it was, at first they didn't want to answer, but then they explained, it's actually not a single tree. It was two different vines intertwined. It symbolized.
And what's that a symbol of?
It was a symbol of two men who had an illicit relationship that the society didn't accept. So what we were dealing with here was a troubled young man who had sexual impulses that were not acceptable to society, and so he went and he joined an organization that that was characterized by religiously sanctioned suicide, which is a very powerful thing, right? And so there's a lot of underneath the surface of the religion. There's a lot of other things going on, right? And I think often those other things are much keener or much more powerful drivers than the religion. I mean, even the Al Qaeda ideology, if you look at it from a psychological point of view, I mean, there's all this elaborate veneer of references to classical authorities and so on. But the message is just go do it, right? It's a Nike message. It's go kill, go blow up, go blow yourself up, and so on. And that appeals to people. I read a fantastic document that we, the United States, took off of an Al Qaeda operative in Iraq. He was I'd say a mid-level functionary in the Al Qaeda operation, and who had been carrying out he had been responsible for carrying out suicide bombings against the Americans. And he was a pious individual, and he believed that if you did everything according to Sharia, then everything was going to work out for you. But things weren't working out, and he was trying to figure it out why it wasn't working out. One of the great things he told was these guys would come to blow themselves up. They came through the pipeline through Syria to Iraq, and they came to blow themselves up. And when they first got there, they were keen to go attack, but then they would start to get antsy because we had degraded the system so that these guys were no longer very good at putting targets on Americans, right? So the guys would sit there for a week, and then they would get antsy, and then they'd say, well, just give me a gun and let me go shoot. But they didn't have guns to give them, and they weren't organized to do that. And then after week 2, they said, I want to go home. Right? I want to go home. So they were like a ticking time bomb. They got themselves psychologically ready to go blow themselves up, and then they just wanted to go. They wanted to go home after that.
All dressed up and nowhere to blow.
All dressed up and nowhere to blow. Right. So, this is how I see the Middle East. There's a lot of other things going on, and even in the Sunni world. I mean, if you look in Iraq, we see there are tribal identities. There are different locales. In Egypt, if I take your example and you say that it's really the drive of the Muslim Brotherhood that's defining everything.
No, it is defining.
Or it's setting the agenda. I'm not so sure. The regime, the Mubarak regime, pulverized any secular alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood. So they created a two-party system, right? There was the two-party system was regime and Muslim Brotherhood. So anybody out there, for whatever reason, who has a grievance against the regime has only one choice if they want to get involved in politics, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood, right? So I don't know that all that. If we say, I mean, from the polling, to the extent you could trust it, the polling is right now 44% pro-CC, 43% pro-Muslim Brotherhood, right? If we could break down, what does that take us to? 87, right? So 13% doesn't care. Then if we could break down that 43% that is pro-Muslim Brotherhood, and we could actually dig away at it, I bet we would find a whole host of grievances, which would be the sort of collective sociological equivalent of the gay guy who went off to join Al Qaeda. I'm not saying that there's 43% of Egypt is gay. I'm just saying that there are a lot of other agendas.
60%.
There are a lot of other agendas that are being a lot of other agendas and grievances and concerns that take a religious form. But if there was more political alternatives available, they would avail themselves of those alternatives.
Let me ask you guys each a question. And I want to just explore two cases. But first, from an American point of view, and then I'm going to ask you to imagine yourselves from an Israeli point of view. From an American point of view, Hillel, would a more sophisticated understanding of politics in retrospect, have helped us plan better in Iraq. And Mike, the same for you. Would a more sophisticated understanding Hillel, more sophisticated understanding of religion have helped us plan better in Iraq? And Mike, would a more sophisticated understanding of politics have changed American strategy in Iraq?
Who goes first?
Hillel, you go first.
I have to go first and then have him whack me.
I'll go first.
Mike will go first.
No, that's okay. I want to say one thing that bears generally that bears upon the dispute between Mike and me. I'm not saying that everyone is, all the time one thing. But in politics, frankly, what matters is who manages to organize all those disparate things into an objective and marshals it towards that end. Along the way, people will certainly have all sorts of other things going on inside them, but if somehow they get persuaded that the way to see how all those things fit together and can be satisfied or fulfilled is in a certain way, that's what politics turns out to be. Whatever the actual alternative options might be, if there was someone else organizing their politics a different way, and so I think that's just a general rule for the analysis of politics. And I also want to say that yes, there are lots of things going on which are overlap and then are ambiguous, cut different ways. For example, take the Sunni question, the tribal identities and the preoccupation with tribal honor and so forth. That has at one level, that's just tribal. But the preoccupation with honor is, it creates a kind of, it's a fact of life in their sensibility, which is also connected, can also be translated into not merely their honor or the honor of the tribe, but the honor of the religion. So, for example, you have, a statement when Baghdadi announces he's the caliph in Mosul. His speech was rather interesting, but among other things, he announced, Muslims, the hour of your redeemed honor has come. And he says that, I think, partially because he knows his audience cares about honor. They may not conceive of honor as important in the way he does, but he knows they care about honor because he's from that, and they care about honor. The problem we have, and this we'll get to where you asked about the religious question, we are so unmoved in our own politics by considerations of honor, by which I don't mean we're not moved by vanity and all sorts of things related to it, but honor has ceased to be, and glory are terms in American politics, I think generally in Western politics, which are considered to be distasteful, repulsive. So our own politics doesn't provide us with much of a way of naturally understanding the motives of people who are concerned with honor and glory. Now, as for Iraq itself, I thought in 2003 that we would have a big hole to climb out of, but we could do it if we took it into account. And the hole was that in 1991 we encouraged the Shiites to revolt against Saddam Hussein at the end of the first Gulf War, and then we left them hanging out to dry. So that when we went in with our view was, well, we're coming to liberate the country, and the Shiites are going to get a fair shake, and so on and so forth. At that point, there was a total lack of trust of that, or confidence in that. I mean, I think some people were persuaded. I remember a meeting at the Pentagon. I was supposed to meet with Wolfowitz and we were delayed a little bit. The meeting was delayed a little bit because he was meeting with a whole bunch of Shiite clerics, and I was escorting Gilles Capel, a French expert, who was just astounded that all these guys were coming out of Wolfitz's office, and they, you know, I think he had a good relationship with them. But at the time, I said to him, look, they're still going to be distrustful of you because, maybe not them, but the people they speak for, because we abandoned these people in '91. And of course, Wolfowitz was involved in that war too, so he knew very well about that abandonment. And he had actually been opposed to the policy adopted at that point to halt our advance into Iraq. So that was the kind of stuff we needed to understand. We needed to understand how abandoned they felt, how resentful, how much they would look at it, the Saddam Hussein regime, as a regime of Sunnis. How much the Sunnis were, you know, persuaded that they were the majority in the country. This was one of the, seems fantastic because we take numbers seriously, like the CIA fact book says, well, they're 20% of the country is Sunni Arab. That's not what the Sunni Arabs thought. They thought they were the majority. So those kinds of things were important to appreciate, and we didn't have a natural feel for it, and there was no one at a higher enough level saying, you know, pay attention to all of this stuff. We learned the hard way when in 2006 when all hell broke loose.
I agree with the proposition that you put to me. And if I just first respond to what Hillel said about honor very quickly, and then I'll answer the Iraq question. It's true that you can transpose a sense of personal honor onto the religious honor very easily, and one could go right into the other. But I think the notion that there's some kind of a unity, I think the unity there is overplayed. If that sense of collective honor, rather than personal or family or tribal honor, were a powerful factor, then the Muslims would have organized against Israel a long time ago, right? And it's really hard to find an Arab-Israeli war where the Muslims were actually unified with each other in any meaningful way against the Israelis. So the way I look at the Arab world, whether it's Arab nationalism or Islamic unity, is you have everybody marching to the beat of the same drum, but they're all going in totally different directions and often running into each other and fighting with each other.
That's a nice analogy.
So if you look at it from, you know, if you just listen to the drum and you watch everybody marching, it looks like a unity, but it doesn't. Once you go one step below that, it's not there. Okay, with respect to Iraq. There's a lot we didn't know. We didn't pay attention to the politics. We weren't focused on religion either. I agree with what Hillel said, although I would put the emphasis differently. Go back to the distinction I made between religion as ideas about the deity or the everlasting, and as opposed to just identity, right? We didn't pay attention close enough to the identity questions. We assumed that that there was an Iraqi national identity that was very powerful. Iraq was a country, and once we set up the institutions for a more I wouldn't say democratic, can't find the word I'm looking for. We set up democratic institutions, right? That this national identity would take over, and there would be a sense of collective interest that would dominate, and that didn't exist. And we didn't pay attention to things like the fact that we got on cell phones as we invaded Iraq, and we told all of the officers. We got in touch with all the officers in the Army and said, if you don't fight, we will not disband the Army, which was primarily a Sunni institution. And then
we disbanded the Army.
We disbanded the Army, and we deprived all these people of their livelihood, which is, now, when I was in the Defense Department, we did a study very quietly of why we had 26,000 detainees in Iraq, and we did a study of why they took up arms against the United States.
All of them did?
Of the well, from among those who did, in the 26,000.
This is like the CIA report. How many of them did or not? We saw yesterday.
So how many did?
Okay. I heard Feinstein reading the report. You probably heard the report. She
Yeah,
said
the
out
torture
of the
report.
people, the torture report, that she said a third of them were not implicated at all. Not that I'm against torture.
No. Yeah. No. This is nothing to do with torture. Just why did you take up arms?
Yeah.
And it was very interesting. The number one reason for taking up arms. Can anyone guess?
It's the number one stated reason, not the number one reason.
Okay. Well.
Very different.
All right. You want to impugn that? You don't know anything. You don't know anything about the study, and you want to impugn it. Let's just, for the sake of discussion, let's assume that it was a very rigorous study. All right. Then, so the conclusion of those who did the study was the number one reason.
Money.
Money. They were paid. The number two reason.
Women.
No, they were intimidated. They were either they or a member of their family was threatened. The number three reason was a political grievance against the United States. So we dropped a bomb on the wrong house. We disbanded the army. Whatever. It was only when you got down to the fifth reason. I can't remember what the fourth one was. It was only when you got down to the fifth one that it was absolute commitment to the ideology of Al Qaeda. And on the basis of this, this kind of study, they immediately separated out the hardcore ideological guys from everybody else, right, and moved them to their own pen. And they suddenly had a totally different problem on their hands. They had the problematic ones, and the other group was very, very easy to deal with. And that, for me, is a metaphor for the whole situation.
Well, one thing since Iraq is one of the central examples, Mike keeps talking about religion as this ideas about ultimate reality, the afterlife, and so forth, and politics being something else. And the question is whether then if that isn't a misunderstanding or a misapplication of what might be the truth, but not the truth as they see it. And here, I'd like to cite something else a document we came across, which was a philosophic theological disquisition by the late political philosopher Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was head of Al Qaeda in Iraq at the time of his demise. And he wrote this letter opposing participation in the elections, which is really a kind of political treatise, in which he says the problem with this is that it's Christian. He literally, practically says that. He says, well, the problem is not merely democracy, it's liberal democracy. And liberal democracy makes this distinction between what belongs to man and what belongs to Allah. You can tell where that formula comes from. He thinks that there is a kind of, there's this fundamental distinction between the way in which we look at the world and the way they look at the world. Naturally, the way they look at the world is right, and lots of stuff follows from that. It was impressive for a guy who started out as merely a street thug and first-class murderer in Zarqa. So I'm not saying this is everything. I'm just saying that there are people for whom this is the way the world looks, and it looks very different than the world looks to us, because, if I may put it this way in this gathering, we are Christians. We have a Christian political tradition in this country, and in the West generally, which has made a certain kind of division between religion and politics that Muslims may make, or they may make a division between religion and their politics for other reasons because they belong to some tribe and so on and so forth, but they don't make it for our reasons. They make it for different reasons, and that you get, you can get the dynamic that I was talking about before. You know, there was an observation made by Sam Huntington, who's famous for the Clash of Civilizations thing, but he once said that from the perspective of political science or political theory, the problem with the Muslim world is that you either have very big or very small. The state, the problem with the state in the Muslim world was that the loyalties are either, if you like, to the afterlife as Muslims, or they're to my tribe. And it's very hard to put, you know, to create what we understand as a, you know, functional political order under modern circumstances out of those kinds of identities.
Well, it might just be that the categories that we're thinking in are just inadequate to the phenomena we're trying to understand. Still,
just asking you, Jonathan, when you say the phenomena we're trying to understand,
yeah.
I don't understand which phenomena we're trying to understand.
I think it's why this world is so crazy and violent and dangerous. Yeah.
So I would say, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I'd say that our categories of religion and politics might assume a certain Christian inheritance, and Jews might therefore have a special role in bridging the West's understanding of Islam. But our categories are being used to help us try to understand this Islamic world.
I think sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think our categories distort our understanding along the lines of the way I was saying. Because if you say that there are these two distinct categories, religion and politics, then what happens is that the minute we hear somebody giving a religious explanation for what he's doing, we assume, oh, that's in the religion category, right? When actually, if we stop for a second and look at it a little bit more closely, see, it's much more in the political category than we're allowing, because it seems to be such a stark division to us.
Well, so let me just ask this.
By the way, there's this thing of how you deal with this. There's an interesting case from the Israeli experience that has directly to do with Hamas and Fatah. So, and even earlier, after '67, the question was what to do with the forces within the territories. One way to have dealt with it was to sort of reinstate the given order, which was basically the big Palestinian clans. As far as I recall, Dayan was against that because the clans were connected to Jordan, and he was still worried about a revival of the conflict in which Jordan would have a powerful hold on the West Bank. Then came Fatah and so forth, and presented a new problem. Part of the Israeli response to that was to actually take a fairly benign view of the predecessor of Hamas, which was the Palestinian branch of the Brotherhood, on the grounds that that was religious, that they wouldn't, that Arafat's movement was political, it was national. That was the main threat, whereas I don't know what they imagined the Brotherhood was like exactly, but something a little bit like maybe the Neturei Karta. They would stay in their own Mea Sharim, and they would draw people away from the national struggle because of their religious preoccupations, which was, considering how close Israelis live in proximity to the problem, a remarkable misunderstanding of what the balance of forces could be and turned out to be.
Opponents of Israel, Israel haters, always use that. That's one of their lines. That's one of their take-out punches. Israel created Hamas. In other other words, they had it coming, they outsmarted themselves. Now they're complaining, but they created it.
Well, they didn't create it. No, the Brotherhood.
No, but that's what they say.
But it was there, and there were people within the intelligence and security apparatus who said, of the threats that we face, this is the lesser one.
It's just before less was invented, it was just social affairs, and then.
Well, the Brotherhood had a chapter, and it also had its own breakaway. Hizb ut-Tahrir had been formed out of the Palestinian Brotherhood, but you know, one makes these mistakes if you look at the world. Also, it's really very hard to anticipate what's going to happen. I mean, for example, go back to Iraq. If we had understood that we might have to fight in Iraq 12 years later, we would have looked at things a lot differently in '91.
Let me ask a question that's, I think, obviously pressing for Israeli decision makers and Americans too. But let me ask about Turkey. And if there's a different taste in thinking that each of you, different way that you see the world, would lead you to a different analysis of how Turkey has changed in the last years, and especially vis-a-vis Israel, how you see it changing in the near future. Mike, you go first for this one.
Turkey. I was thinking about Turkey when you were mentioning Zarqawi, and you said Huntington said you either have very big or very little. I think that's a description of some Arab politics, but I don't think it's a description of Islamic politics writ large. And I don't think I don't think it fits in Turkey, because I think there is Turkish nationalism. In Turkey is a nation state on the European model. It's an imperfect one, especially imperfect because of the Kurds. But there is a relatively felicitous match between nation and state in Turkey. I think if I look at the foreign policy of Turkey over the last few years, I think it makes my point perfectly. Of course I would. Erdogan and Davutoglu. Davutoglu was the intellectual architect of their foreign policy, and Davutoglu, their ideas about their relationship to all other Muslims were incubated in a little bubble, in a Turkish bubble, where they were constantly being put down by the Kemalist state, and they developed very naive notions about the unity of the Muslims. And they assumed once they took power and they started making a policy on the basis of the unity of Muslims that this thing would take over, and we would have Erdogan of Arabia. And they made the classic mistake as well of assuming that if they beat the Palestine drum, they would be able to organize everyone around them. And Davutoglu's idea, which was Erdogan's idea as well, was zero problems with neighbors, right? The problem with the more secular Turkish governments is that they hadn't reached out to their Muslim neighbors. Erdogan was going to be different, and so we were going to have no problems with Iran, no problems with Syria, no problems with any of the Muslims. We're going to have big problems with the Jews because they're oppressing the Palestinians, and so on and so forth. And zero problems with neighbors is a policy that works if the neighbors have no problems with each other. But if the neighbors have big problems with each other, which the Arabs do, then if you choose one Arab, and if you say I have zero problems with this neighbor, then there are then the Arabs who have problems with that neighbors have problems with you.
Or amongst themselves, as in Egypt.
Yeah, or amongst themselves, as in Egypt, exactly. Or between and as well with Iran. Once the rebellion broke out in Syria, for a while Erdogan sat on the fence, tried to mediate. That didn't work. He then turned against Assad. As he turned against Assad, he then had a problem with Iran, and the whole thing fell apart. And then, as you mentioned, the great example. Egypt, his policy really fell on its face there. I mean, Sisi has now basically broken relations with Erdogan because Erdogan picked the Muslim Brotherhood over the over Sisi. Now, I would.
Still got Hamas, though.
He still has Hamas. He's holding on to that one. He's holding on to that one. And you know, and Erdogan, I think personally, I
it's
assume
very good domestic politics. It's not only regional politics. It's been good domestic politics.
Yeah, no, it's been it's been good
to beat Israel.
Sure, sure. It's been good. It's been good domestic politics. Sure, but the collapse of the foreign policy, I think, shows the weakness of the principle. And look, he's going to continue. I think he's an anti-Semite personally. I think he gets a domestic boost out of being anti-Israel. I think he gets a personal boost out of it for sure. But the Islamic unity part is not going to. He's not going to make many money off of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with it. But let's talk about, you know, I think Turkey is a really very, very, very interesting and important case for trying to understand all of this, but it doesn't have to explain everything. First of all, I mean, Turkey is a modern nation state. Turkey is a modern nation state because of Ataturk. And it's a modern nation state because of Ataturk, because Ataturk made it possible to have any state. I mean, remember, in 1920, the country was occupied by Italians, French, British, Greeks, and so forth. Ataturk led a campaign to drive all these people out of Turkey, or what was left of Turkey, and you know that created this thing, as you say, imperfectly, because it doesn't properly embrace the Kurdish ethnic group, and they still don't know what they're going to do with that. So whether it'll even, you know, it seems to me at least possible, given what's been going on with the Kurds and all, that, you know, Southeast Turkey may no longer, in the 20 years from now, be part of Turkey. Then there's the question of the bubble of Erdogan. The bubble he grew up in was the Islamist bubble. That's what he did think. I agree with you. He's been an immensely successful domestic politician and an extraordinary failure in foreign affairs. And the more he fails, the crazier the rhetoric gets about what they're going to do. I mean, the latest thing is now every Turkish kid is going to have to learn Ottoman Turkish. That's the latest school reform.
I find that funnier than you guys do. It's really funny.
The crazy thing is, in Ottoman times, they didn't speak Ottoman Turkish. I mean, it was a language that was unique to the court and the bureaucracy. It's sort of like it's as if the Ottoman Empire was a democracy in which everyone spoke the language of the state. It's crackers, but he's going to go forward with these things to try to make Turkey a more religious country. That's what he's doing all the time, and it'll be interesting to see what happens along those lines. And that is the basis for his notion that Turkey is destined to be the leader of the Muslim world in its resurgence. I mean, that you get from Deftolo all the time, and he describes the party as not a party but a project of a century. And they're already getting ready to celebrate. If they won't live that long, but their heirs, their children and grandchildren will live to the really important date of 2071, which is the 1000th anniversary of the Battle of Manzikert. This is, they're living in some very strange romantic fantasy, and I grant you that has come up against some very hard realities, but they're persisting in living in it. So we'll see what happens. But now to take Mike's side of this.
Oh, don't do that.
No, just the whole Israel bashing thing. So there is this little problem with bashing Israel. There's a lot of trade between Israel and Turkey, but there's also a lot of trade between Turkey and the Gulf that now has to go through Israel. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but you know, you can't send trucks through Syria anymore because they get hit by barrel bombs and stuff like that. And so all the truck traffic that used to go through Syria had to find another route. Well, there were a couple of possibilities. You can send it through the canal, but that's expensive. You could send it overland. You could offload it to Mediterranean ports and then drive it across Egypt, and then ferry it across to Yemen or Saudi Arabia or Jordan. And that's cheaper because you don't have to pay the canal fees. Or you could send it across Israel, offload it at Haifa, goes across the Galil, and then into Jordan. So for a while, all three things were operative. But then there was this bit of the business of the coup, and Erdogan started attacking Sisi. And so about 3 weeks ago, they had an agreement with Turkey to allow the trucks to go across Egypt. It expired, and Sisi said, I'm not renewing it. So now all the truck traffic has to go through Israel unless you're going to pay the canal fees. And in fact, someone told me the other day that the old railroad that goes across from... No, the railroad, there was an old railroad line that went from Haifa to, I guess actually... Yeah, they're going to refurbish the railroad so
First
that...
they have to build the railroad in Tel Aviv, wait.
No, this is foreign investment.
That's right.
We will see.
So Israel is now the main transshipment point for
Not
Turkish...
It's not.
I've been watching them build that.
I just can't help. I love the image of trucks arriving in Riyadh or wherever they end up, and like Bamba wrappers falling out of the. I think it'd be good if we just open it up, take some questions. Professor Shane.
Look, there are lots of issues that I cannot, of course, address in terms of we're trying to make some coherence. And you began by saying, like, we look at this phenomena of this brutality, collapse of states, deranged ideology, or whatever it is, you want to call it anyway. You want to call it seeds of religion or not religion. You say just sheer, I don't know how you call it, sheer regressiveness or whatever it is. But it's a clear case. It comes also at a time when the Arabs, at least, were attempting to create, at least there was a sign of what we call the Arab Spring. Of course, prior to that, there was the Gulf War and in Afghanistan. There are lots of things happening, and there seems to me there is another phenomena here. And the phenomena here is interesting enough. It's the collapse of leadership in the Muslim world. You look at the Arab Revolution, so to speak. And I've written about it, and I was looking at it's an interesting case for me. I said, can you identify one leader of the Arab Spring? I asked students, I said, can you identify one leader? Leaderless revolutions, where it happened. If you read Barrington Moore, if you read Brinton about the anatomy of revolution, you always have leaders in revolutions. Here you didn't have one name of a leader. These were, people remember, Buttigieg that burned himself, but it's not a leader. It's kind of symbols of revolution. It's like Jan Palach in Czechoslovakia. But there was not one single leader. I wrote about it, saying, look, this is interesting. So when you have a world was devoid of leaders, and the streets are masses, so there are lots of streams in the Arab world, and I don't think, and this remains, that other voices are not heard. We see the Egyptians. Who could have imagined? You know, Eliot spoke about the miracle of Sisi. I don't know who coined the term miracle of Sisi. I think he mentioned the miracle of Sisi, right?
That was yesterday. It was in
Yesterday. It's really, who could have imagined that Morsi will collapse like that? No one could have imagined that 20 million, or whatever the number is, will assemble to the streets to contest the Muslim Brotherhood. The thesis has been that once Muslims are coming, it's over. It's like Iran. It's like Khomeini taking over Mahdi Mazargan and it's over. The revolutionary sort of like. So my question to you is, after this long introduction, in this court, when there is a lack of court, this kind of, and you know, I think Nasrallah is a leader. And Nasrallah is a very important leader. He has like has a voice. But outside Nasrallah, where do you identify these voices that will have to? Baghdadi is this guy that will really will assemble this, or this will be like the Wild West with crazies, a la Boko Haram, what you said, or sort of like crazies all around. Let's say they will chop heads, rape, whatever, because it's there is no, it's no man's land.
Well, there's one side where there is leadership. You'll see.
Sisi's now, I think.
No, I mean, if it's just the Arab world, that's one thing. But if it's the Middle East, you know, the crowd that has the wind at their the crowd that has the wind at their backs are the Shiites or the radical Shiites, and that's because they have a kind of there's a regime there that has a focus and it goes about its business. It's evil business, but they go about it in a very direct way.
Limited in the Middle East. It's not the dominant factor in the Middle East, the Shiites, as you very well know. Shiites are not the dominant factor. They're important.
But al-Baghdadi is.
But yeah, but Baghdadi is a different story. That's what I'm saying. If he
Why do you? I don't quite understand. What do you think? Because there are fewer Shiites. Is that it? Because there are fewer Shiites?
Yes, because there are fewer Shiites, and in the long run, there will always be, the Shiites in the Middle East cannot dominate the Middle East. They are, for the Sunnis, for the vast majority, the nemesis of the Middle East. They're the nemesis. Of course, Jews is a different story, but the Shiites are the nemesis. The struggle is not over yet. And so you have, Shiites are not the group that can dominate the Middle East. They can cause lots of harm, they can cause havoc, but they're not the Sunnis, you know, they look at them as...
I don't know, within the last month, one senior Iranian guy said, we control 4 Arab capitals, which is the truth.
Yeah,
so...
I would not say they... Look,
you know, I mean, this is this thing... actually, we had a version of this discussion. Yeah, there are more Sunnis than Shiites, but, you know, there are more Shiites and Sunnis than there are Jews.
But
and you're still there. So my point is, it's not, you know...
the leadership? My question is, where the leadership come from?
I think that's a great point that you made. And I wish I had said it, because I think it's, I can't tell you where the leadership's going to come from, but what you described, the absolute absence of leadership and these crowd movements that moving in lots of different directions, that's part of the, I mean, that's a great symptom of the problem, because these regimes that were created or that developed in the Middle East, they destroyed all civil society, any intermediary organizations. And now as the regime crumbles, there are these masses of discontented people, but there is no, the only groups that are, that do have leadership and organization are the Islamic groups. And I think it gives us a distorted picture of what's actually going on the ground, because they have an outsized muscle because of their organizational ability, because they had a head start over everybody else. Same thing in Egypt. Mubarak destroyed all intermediary organizations, and we had the Muslim Brotherhood, and so it had a head start on everybody. So what we're dealing with is a part of the world that's going through a historical crisis. And it's gonna go on for a long time, and it's gonna be extremely ugly, and it's going on many different levels. So I can't say where the leadership is going to come from, but I think what you described is a big part of the problem, more than the religion. It's this absence of leadership, this absence of organization, absence of intermediate groups that can mediate between the outside world and the society.
I would say, you'll see, I mean, I think it's most likely to be the case that Mike's right. The scenario is just going to go on as a crisis. The one possibility is if Sisi turns out to be a leader, and because if he's in some ways effective, there are people around that want to follow that lead. That is to say, the Saudis and the Gulfies and so forth. And you know, they've just now put the arm on Qatar and forced Qatar to say that they recognize the legitimacy of Sisi's administration. So, but it depends on whether he has real leadership skills. I mean, it really depends on whether he's got what it takes to figure out what Egypt needs and what he could do in the region as a whole.
If I could just make one other sentence, I think your point about Nasrallah too, it's very interesting. He really, as a leader, he really stands out in the whole landscape as something different than...
It's also the diaspora. The diaspora have only leaders like Nasrallah. The Muslim diasporas have only leaders like, if you look at France and England, these are the leaders. There are no leaders that come with any other interpretation of Arabism or Islam but these leaders. That's why it's like that, in my opinion.
Rana.
So I will ask another question. What do you think are the prospects that disintegrating Iraq and Syria, maybe Lebanon and Libya, Yemen, and reconstructing borders can enhance the stability of the Middle East in light of this disintegration that is along the religious ethnic lines?
Like Yugoslavia.
That looks like speak up.
Should I go?
Well, yeah, you can
No.
go ahead.
I don't see it as enhancing the stability. I see it as, I mean, on one hand, it's a net benefit for Israel, if that's what you were. Not from the Israeli point of view. From the Arab perspective.
Disastrous for Israel in the short term.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's disastrous for Israel. I mean, if I just go off on the Israel thing for a second, and I'll get back to it's for Israel. It's kind of best of times, worst of times. I mean, there's in terms of conventional threat to Israel, there's never been a safer period. I mean, there's no Arab army out there that could really threaten Israel. But I mean, the storm all around is really disturbing, and some of the trends, particularly the rise of Iran, is troubling. But back to your original question, I don't see it as I don't see any prospect of long-term stability coming out of this. It's really hard for me to see. I mean, to see the scenario. I can see because what we have now from Baghdad to Beirut almost, certainly Baghdad to Aleppo, is a big no man's land. That's a contested space. And you can see, the caliphate is going to put order, and you can see there are some states around that have an interest in stability, but they're incapable of working together to actually create stability, and even ones where if the United States were to step in and work very hard to stabilize that area, it could probably come up with a formula, that would satisfy, say, Saudi Arabia and Turkey and mobilize resources of both to do it. And that's not an easy prospect because Turkey's been supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia's been against it. So there's some real conflicts there. But let's just say, for the sake of discussion, they could probably come up with a formula for getting them to work together. But it requires a real vigorous U.S. leadership, which the United States is probably not going to exercise, or at least the Obama administration is certainly not going to, and I have doubts about the next administration too. So I see that area from Damascus to Baghdad as being in play for a very long time.
Yeah.
Eric? So a question for each of you. First, Mike, I still don't fully understand how you see the relation between Islamic faith and politics. Meaning, clearly there are many millions of faithful Muslims, and their Muslim belief has some implications for how they see political life. So what are the political implications, as you see it, of Islamic faith? And then for Hillel, assuming you're right that the Islamic longing for Islamic glory is part of central, important part of the story and part of the dysfunction in this part of the world. Is this an authentic Islamic yearning, or is it a deformation of Islam? And are there resources within Islam itself to reform this in some way that might lead to what, from a Western perspective, would look like a more appealing future?
Should I go first? Let me start by going back to the beginning of time, and then I'll go to the present. Islam, by the 11th century, all of the Islamic states were in the Middle East were run by Turkish slave soldiers, and they, all the way up, all the ruling elite of the Middle East, Arab and non-Arab, up until the 20th century, was ruled by Turks. And you had a de facto separation of religious and political life. Or at least you had much more of a situation for the average Muslim of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God, than we learn in our textbooks when we learn that Islam and politics are intertwined. Islamic law, which says, you know, Islam purports to organize every aspect of human life. But that vision of Islam was developed by scholars who had no connection to the state. So it's a very idealized view of what Islam is. And most of the Islamic laws, the Islamic legal treaties always have the segment on the state and on politics. They have nothing to do. No Islamic state up until yesterday ever had anything to do with those treatises, which were written by scholars who were people who were paid by merchants to write scholarship and had no practical training whatsoever. So for the average Muslim, for most of the history of the Middle East, Islam, the Islam that you paid closest attention to was personal status, marriage, divorce, and that sort of thing. Politics wasn't something that you engaged in, and I think we're seeing that all the way down to this all the way down to this day. If we talk about, I would be very hard pressed to talk in the abstract about religion and politics. You can talk about, once you give me a specific country, and we talk about Islam and politics in that country, and I have specific groups who are making interpretations, the Zarqawi and so on, then I can start really going to town. But in the abstract, it's very hard for me to say much more than what I've said, except to point out that I think there's this distinction between religion and politics is, in the tradition, as it actually played out, is much greater than we admit.
Maybe the place to start to answer your question, Eric, is where Mike left off, and to say it's quite true that a kind of separation between religious authority and political authority existed through large parts of Muslim history. The problem, though, is, especially now, is that there were the earliest periods looking back, look like periods in which that wasn't the case. And it was, when the Turks, when these countries or polities, whatever you want to call them, were ruled by Turkish slave soldiers. That's another interesting fact, which we haven't talked about, which was the way in which the Muslim polities organized themselves for war and how that affected their politics and their relationship with religion. It was observed as early as Plato that the decisions you either want to make or have to make about conducting war affect your politics, and of course Machiavelli underscored that a lot. And I think that has to be taken into account in understanding what the politics of the past was. But the problem is, there was a period in which Muslim politics didn't look like that. It looked like there was a kind of union of religion and politics, and that union was associated with the greatest success. Whether it was or not, one could dispute that, but that's the way it looks to people looking back after a whole era of failure. To take, an analogy, in the 19th century, people started to dream of bringing back the Middle Ages. Well, they didn't dream, the Middle Ages was gone. They couldn't continue it. They had to imagine it, and the way they imagined it was artificial and not consistent with what the Middle Ages had been like. But it took on a reality of its own, and produced various things like, proto-fascism and so forth, which saw themselves as looking back. And the problem we have now is that's still, it seems to me, the sensibility of people that, we were once on top of the world, and now we're dreck. So.
That's an Arabic term, dreck?
Yeah.
And resources for reform?
So then, how could this play itself out? I think for the time being, people are going to keep knocking their heads up against the wall of trying to, bring this glorious past back to life. And by the way, this is not the first time this has happened in Muslim history. There have been a lot of reform movements in Muslim history, which also took their bearings from the founding and sort of said, we've fallen away, and so on and so forth. The only problem with this period, the difference is that they were always more or less successful. Now there really are failures. So I think it may be that the Islamic State represents a kind of opening. Not yet. It is, the Islamic State is really delivers on, at least on the Sunni side, what the Sunni reform movement has been claiming it was about for 100, even 150 years. We're going to have this Islamic State, and it's going to turn everything around. Well, now we have this Islamic State, and I think that's part of why it is so appealing. I mean, it's not just the intimidation and various other things. People have been hungering for this in the Islamist movement. You'll hear people say, the Brotherhood never delivered this. Al-Qaeda didn't deliver this. They were always talking about the Islamic State. What did they do? Nothing. These guys delivered. We have an Islamic State. So a lot, I think, now turns on the fate of that state. If it lasts a long time, it may have a powerful influence for malign influence. If it really goes down and in flames, people may sort of say, okay, our longings for a state were fulfilled, and we found out it's an empty longing. And out of that could be generated some kind of rethinking of what the project has to be for them. That's what I would say at this point.
Can you say a few more sentences on what that rethinking could be? I mean, what would an authentic Islam that is sane and reconciled to modernity and has a different conception of their past, but with a certain dignity, look like? I mean, it's hard to see what that...
Yes, it is very hard to see. I mean, there were a few people, including my teacher, Fazlur Rahman, who had some notions on this score, and they were driven out of the respectable universe. So, but some of their ideas may come now back to the fore. I think Suppose, let's put it this way. I'm sorry to keep reverting to Sisi, but right now it seems to me he's kind of the ball game. And in ways that I think a lot of policy analysts, not including Mike, but everyone sort of in Washington wants to beat the hell out of him, left and right. There's, you know, it may be that he will figure out, as I said before, that he's got somehow in mind a way of blending a new national patriotic project with sort of religious attachment. And it may only work for Egypt, but if it works for Egypt, maybe other people start thinking that it's something that they could try too. That would be one thing within the at least within the Arab world. It's a different matter with Iran. In the case of Iran and the Shiites generally, maybe sometimes someone will take down the regime and give other things opportunities to develop. It's reasonable to think that in Iran itself there are a lot of people who would like an alternative, but are not going to do it unless, are not going to have an opportunity to operate unless the regime is weakened. And so you could have, I think, competing decent reform projects in different parts of the Muslim world, or at least the Middle East. One possibility is, I think, Egypt now, and the other possibility is something that develops out of a diminished or defeated Iran. And finally, there's a possibility that the looniness we were talking about before in Turkey takes Turkey to a point at which people, react and say, we need to rethink this whole our Turkish national project. We have to revert to a kind of national self-understanding rather than these insane ambitions on the Islamic side.
I thought of something that I should have said in response to your question. When it comes to relations with non-Muslims, I think there's some very obvious trends. There's an assumption, as Hillel said, there's an assumption that the Muslims should rule. There's a generally accepted premise that the goal of government is to protect the Muslim community, and there's a generally accepted premise that the Muslims shouldn't be ruled over by non-Muslims. So you're never going to have a Coptic president of Egypt, and that also then translates into generates an extra dimension of resentment toward the Western domination that has existed for the last 2 centuries. Now, there's still, you can find a lot of variation within that, but there are those attitudes. I mean, that's just a given. And a lot of the resentment toward Israel, or a big segment of the resentment toward Israel, has to do with that, right? There's nothing that drives home to the Muslims writ large the degradation, the dishonor of Western domination than the fact that they implanted, as the story goes, that they implanted a Jewish state in their midst, and that the Jews are lording it over the
that Jews have
any
kind of state. I mean, this is, I think, that's why partially I'm inclined to the notions that I have. It goes back to really the way in which the Quran presents what the project's going to be. We're going to replace Judaism and Christianity, but replacing Judaism isn't a big project. Replacing Christianity is a big project. There's a lot more Christians. So for a long time, Judaism, or Jews, to quote the Arabic subtitle of a Jewish book called the Kuzari, was the Din Adhalil, the despised religion. That's, as you've looked at the Kuzari, he's defending the Din Adhalil. So I think what drives Muslims really crazy about Israel ultimately is the fact that Israel exists, that there's a Jewish state, is like, it's as if there's something wrong metaphysically. How is it possible that the course of history has taken this weird turn where Jews have power again? And there, it seems to be the case that some guys in that universe are beginning to settle down with the notion that, yeah, Jews are going to have a state. The Egyptians, the Saudis, the Jordanians, obviously. That may be a positive development, that they'll sort of get off of that obsession.
But you can, I mean, you can take that too far too, because look, Egypt made peace with Israel, and the peace is held. It's striking how we've had changes of regime in Egypt and all the upheaval in Egypt, and the peace is held. And when there were many voices that said in 2011 that once the Mubarak regime went, then the peace was going to be wiped away, and it wasn't. Even more striking in some ways is the peace with Jordan. Jordan is a majority Palestinian society, so you have, if it is true that there is this generalized Muslim resentment, then you have combined with that the Palestinian national resentment, and yet it's holding. So I wouldn't. I mean, if you forced me to make general statements about the relationship between religion and politics on a sort of mega scale, I could say something like that, but I would immediately want to qualify it.
Jonathan.
I have two questions. First, to Michael. So this is something I think Bernard Lewis pointed out. The difference between the IRA and the Muslim Brotherhood is that the IRA never claimed to be fighting for Catholicism, whereas the Muslim Brotherhood and al-Baghdadi, they are saying specifically in their words, and the people who grew up in London and people who cut heads in the West, they say they're doing it because of Islam. So it seems to be so bizarre that academics are going to jump through hoops, find any other excuse other than what people are saying. I don't think for any other movement people are looking for other reasons when people are quite explicit about what they're saying. That's one question. And to Hillel, my question is if the problem is indeed with some of the issues with Islam, so I think maybe the question should be more about when do we think Islam is going to go through some sort of reformation that Judaism and Christianity has gone through? Is there any hope? So I guess the focus should be what do we see internal forces, there's some sort of things that other religions have gone through that made them go through changes. Happened 500 years ago. For Christianity, maybe 200 years ago for Judaism. Is there any prospect of something like that in this country?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a big difference between the IRA and the and the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's not a completely insignificant difference. I wouldn't say that. I'm trying to argue for a corrective to the notion that says, aha, we've identified them as a Muslim political organization, we don't need to know anything else. Right? It's simply not the case. I mean, there's a way in which we stop thinking about them and analyzing them the minute we know that they're Muslim, or that they have an explicitly Islamist agenda. The fact of the matter is that once you get past the slogans, once you get past say in Egypt, the protest movement, right? The undifferentiated desire for an end to the status quo. They don't have a lot to offer, right? The slogan "Islam is the answer" is a great slogan when you just want to topple Mubarak, that bastard, right? But then once you're in power and you have to answer all the questions about how to make the economy work, and what does Islam have to say about an economy? Just about nothing. No birth control. All right. So there are a lot of other things. There are a lot of other things going on here. This is my point. And how would you? Well, if I told you that this guy Morsi, this is an argument, by the way, that I had with Israelis often. I loved it that Morsi was in power, right? I loved, not to love it, but one of the things, I got pleasure out of every moment that he had to keep, the terms of the Camp David agreement. I got pleasure out of the fact that he had to keep Iranian missiles from going to Gaza, right? And he was, I got pleasure out of, what? He was doing it. He didn't do as good a job as Sisi, right? But he did as good a job as Mubarak did, for sure. And there was lots of tension between, between Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo. The Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, the round before last in Gaza, by my reading, was an effort of Hamas to embarrass Morsi, and Morsi didn't play their game, and that's quite fascinating. And you can't if you start from the assumption that, well, they have the same ideology, so they're going to work together, you're missing a lot.
Your question is a very good one, and it's a version of the one that Eric just raised. Let me start by saying what I think is a beginning problem, which is principles actually matter. If you have different sets of principles, it's not, you can't simply assume that there will be a process, the same kind of process will apply. There were different principles underlying Christianity and Islam, which permitted, in the case of Christianity, certain kinds of arguments. I mean, there's a certain view that we got to where we are, the West say, because the West, Europe, exhausted itself through civil wars, the religious wars of the 30 Years' War, the French Civil War over religion, and so forth, the English Civil War over religion. No doubt that contributed. People got to a point where they said, you know, we should not go on this way. But there still remains the question of how you get out of it once you're in it. And I'm struck by, at least in our case, the European case, that there were people who made arguments for what was the way to kind of leap to a new reality on the basis of our old principles. One of the most famous cases is John Locke, who comes up with an argument for toleration, or for that matter, Benedict Spinoza. But that argument rests on a certain understanding of conscience, which is not a concept that is particularly powerful in Islam. But Locke didn't leave it at that. I don't know, people don't usually read these things anymore, but I once did read Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity. I don't know if you've ever come across this work. It's about 300 pages of attempt at a new theology. Well, Locke published this, and it was immediately critiqued by, I think, the Bishop of Worcester, who wrote a 300-page reply. Locke wrote another 300 pages in reply to that. The bishop came back at him with another 300 pages. Locke wrote another 400 pages, and I don't remember, the bishop gave up, or they just called it a draw.
The days before Twitter.
But when you think about that, that's just a huge intellectual effort. Obviously, there was all the politics too, the conspiring against the Stuarts, and bringing in William from the Netherlands. But that's the kind of effort that happened. Now, then you have to think about Islam and what would be the equivalent. First, you have to find a set of principles that you could remold. One of the things that's an obstacle to that is the lack of a tradition of interpretation in the sense that we have experienced in Christianity and Judaism. This is why I reference my old teacher, the man named Fazlur Rahman. He was a very pious Muslim, and he wrote a book which is absolutely conservative and traditional, with one little exception. And that was the suggestion that what was thought to be the orthodox view, that the Quran is uncreated, has existed eternally, was wrong. That it was created in the time in which it was revealed. Why was that important? Well, if it's uncreated, it has no context. Now, this is ridiculous on the face of it because the Quran talks about all kinds of things that are going on at that time. But for reasons I won't go into, this came to be the view, a quasi-official view. So Rahman thought, he was a theologian himself, he thought, if you look at the Quran, this is self-evidently false. When Muhammad is instructed to tell the Quraysh that they should come and be with him, he's talking about a real situation and real people of a certain period. Which would be, and secondly, if you can't do that, then you can't say, as the interpretive tradition within Judaism and Christianity has been at least permitted to say, we can take these principles that were revealed in a certain context and understand them in that context and then apply them to a new context. That's been this huge hump that Islamic thought has to overcome.
That just makes the majority of Muslims like Israelis.
What do you mean?
Well, because the Israeli attitude is that the synagogue that I don't go to is Orthodox, right? And so it makes them good Italians as well, right?
That's
of course I'm a Catholic, but I have nothing to do with it.
What you need, I think, at this point, as I was suggesting to Eric before, you need a certain amount of exhaustion with the project. That would be like the way Germany felt in 1648 after half of the population was dead. But you also need some people, maybe a great man who knows how to think this through. There isn't such a person visibly on the scene. There may be people who are saying to themselves, this can't go on. We can't, not only we're not going to win, but we keep digging our hole deeper. And there are a fair number of people who understand that the hole is very deep and getting deeper. You had, for example, in 2002, commissioned this Arab development report by the UN, done by Arab social scientists who came up with these, lamentable statistics about what the regress in the Arab world from, say, 1950, and compare, and among the things that were produced, the total GDP of Arab countries in 2002 was less than the GDP of Spain, not one of the more prosperous countries in Europe. All of this stuff, people know this, they feel it, but someone's got to figure out a path for them to go on.
5-second comment reaction is, of course, as you well know, it's not so clear that John Locke was so good for Christianity. And a very deep Muslim looking at this, he may have been good for peaceful coexistence and material progress and all kinds of things that are worthy of great respect and reverence. But it's also clear that modernity is very good for Christianity. And the question is whether there is a genuinely Islamic project, a reformist project, where the end can still be Islamic faith at some deep level, or the Islamic ordering of human life, that is just more sane than what we have.
I think it's possible, but again, I think because of both the ways in which the original project was conceived, and the other passions that have been aroused, it's just harder. And look, I do know what you mean about the liabilities of modernity for serious faith. On the other hand, there's still a lot of people within the modern world who are seriously faithful, and without.
Not many in Europe.
No. Obviously, there's something very special about the case of the United States. And maybe one would have to think a little bit about why America is so, I mean, you might suggest it's not going to remain that way, I don't know, but that it somehow it escaped the, at least some of the liabilities of modernity.
Jeffrey, you honor us with the last question.
We've been talking about Arabs in power, Islam in power on the international scene. We've been very focused on the question of Jews in power domestically, how Jews came to this not unambivalent relationship to power and to influence here in the United States. On Sunday, I went, even though I was born and raised here, I've been living abroad for a long time, and it was the first chance I've had to be down. I was at the 9/11 museum, and I was somewhat troubled by it. The identity of the perpetrators, the cause in whose name they acted, is muted almost to being complete, not exactly, but almost to complete absence. A school child could come and think that he's witnessing the memorial to buildings that fell down in some natural disaster. I presume that this was a complicated conversation among those that were responsible for doing this, but I also presume that it had something to do with a sense of domestically Arab power, Islamic power, a relationship to things here. How do you see the prospect for what I presume will be the growth and influence of Islamic domestic power on the American scene, and how do you see that in relation to the way that the Jewish relationship to it has unfolded, let's say, over the past 70, 80, 100 years?
Should I take a swipe?
Sure, and I'll take my swipe.
That's very interesting what you say about the memorial. I wouldn't. I don't know anything about the discussions that went into that.
Let me just,
but just
it could be that example that I brought is not correct. It could
right.
be all types of other things. I'm more interested in your question, in your response to the question, not the example.
I still want to jump on the example because it made me think of something that I want to say, if you don't mind. My reading of that is that would be my assumption, without knowing any of the details, would be a little different just because of my sense of who we are and how we operate, and that is that we're very uncomfortable talking about religion and ascribing. I'm about to contradict everything I said tonight, but I think a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So I'm going to show how big my mind is here and say the exact opposite of everything I said. We're so uncomfortable with it and ascribing people's behavior to religion in our domestic life, in our schools, and in our workplaces and so on, that it just makes people very, very nervous, and so they won't do it. There is, of course, also there is a strong movement among, particularly in academia, but in some of the Arab and Muslim communal organizations, to make a distinction between groups like Al Qaeda and Islam, and to say they have nothing to do with Islam and so on. And so if you label them Islamic, then you are quickly accused of being bigoted and so on. So that further increases the discomfort that we have with it. So we just put it aside, and it's a real problem then when it comes to analyzing what's going on in the Middle East, because we don't want to. We're just uncomfortable with the whole topic of religion and politics. But I think it leads to a kind of situation where we either ignore it altogether and pretend it's not there, like you're talking about, or to our peril, or we exaggerate it, because the response is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Sharia is going to take over America crowd, right? They have I think an outsized influence in right-wing politics, precisely because it's a reaction to because we have the academic crowd saying, no, 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 you know, it's all imperialism or Israel or whatever, and or it has nothing to do with religion. And then these guys come along and say, no, no, actually there's this global movement to take over, and we're going to have Sharia in Nebraska and so on. I'm not that worried about it. I believe that, and this is a direct answer to your question, I'm not that worried about it because I think American culture is a tremendous acid which will break down any effort of Sharia to conquer America. Now, I'm also maybe from a Jewish or Israeli point of view, you worry that a significant Arab politics will end up being a significant Arab or Muslim minority in the United States will end up working against Israel. I'm not so sure. If I'd have told you a year or two ago that Israel and Saudi Arabia were going to be in perfect alignment, saying exactly the same thing to Obama. I mean, if you put a bag over Netanyahu's head and a bag over King Abdullah's head and listen to what they're saying to President Obama right now, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. And so I don't think there's ever going to be. You can always bet on the disunity of the Muslims and the disunity of the Arabs. Let's put it that way.
I would say...
Excuse me, and before you answer that, hello, does that acid of America, isn't that actually Eric's point about Locke, too? Meaning that there's just something about this regime, the Enlightenment regime of modernity that we live in, that actually has, in this case, perhaps some healthy but also unhealthy effects on the ability for religious men and women to pass their religion on to their children. In the acid of America, fine, it neutralizes certain vicious aspects of Islam, but that, actually neutralizes other healthy aspects of traditional religion as well.
I'll give that to Hillel because I'm weak on my Locke.
I think what the thing you described and other things like it have been so far not the result of Muslim power and political power. I think they have been the result, it's another way of putting what Mike just said, it's a result of our confusions, and in particular multiculturalism, which is something we've done to ourselves. I mean, it's not something that came with the Muslims population. That is a problem, but it's not a problem. The problem has to be solved, if it's going to be solved, by a discourse that doesn't necessarily have much to do with Muslims. It has to do with a recovery of our own principles. And I would say that also has a lot to do with the future support for Israel. One of the things I think that is really very, very powerful in the relationship between the United States and Israel is the shared principles. People, one might ridicule this because people can't articulate the principles. The Americans can't, the Israelis can't, but I think it's a fact. And that there is a kind of fellow feeling there because of those principles. If those principles continue to be very muddy, it's not going to be, then you get into the situation where the argument is over what I would regard actually as a very narrow issue, on which the issue shouldn't be, Israel shouldn't be treated, which is the question of the Palestinians. That's the problem, that it narrows to that issue as soon as you forget all the rest of what Israel is and what its possible relationship is to the United States. As for the future, though, of Muslims in American society, the acid may be blunted because of we are no longer, in a way, demanding as powerfully as we did in the past assimilation. And there's a person who studies, well, a lot of people who study Muslims in this country. One who's done quite a lot of work on it is Peter Scarry. And a few years back, he wrote an article, I think it was published in the National Interest, National Affairs, sorry. And we had a discussion about it at a think tank in Washington, AEI. And, you know, what he found is what a lot of people have found. There's a lot of Muslims in this country who just want to go along and get along. They want to make their way for themselves, and that's for their families. And that's sort of a part of the asset, just the desire to be part of an American middle-class life and not to put oneself at enormous risk by, you know, radical ideas. But what he did focus on was the fact that there's what needs to happen then also is there has to be a conception of, for Muslims or by Muslims, of what it means to be a Muslim citizen. There has to be a notion of how you are a citizen and a Muslim. And that all other groups in this country have worked that thing out eventually. For Catholics, for whom it was a real problem, could you be a citizen? There were people who worked it out, most notably John Courtney Murray. Scary's observation was that no one has worked that out. It was even trying to work that out among the Muslims, and that's a real liability for the future. There was this case, I guess it was in Illinois, these 3 kids ran off to Syria.
I think they were in Colorado.
No, it was more recent than that. It was yeah, and the family's stunned. They claim they don't know what happened. It's 2 brothers and a sister. They didn't get there because they had apparently put up enough traffic on Facebook or something.
They were arrested in Germany, I think. They were stopped in Germany.
I'm not sure where they were stopped, but and these were actually pretty middle-class kids. So there remains a kind of temptation there that, I mentioned only because there's nothing really on an intellectual or moral level pushing back at it. So one doesn't know how that's going to turn out.
Friends, join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you.